Play Alchemy.
Hello friends, it's Play Alchemy today, where what matters most is how we're going to play today. So I have my friend here, Chris Lane, and he's also a long-standing alumni at the School of Play, having participated in Playful Leadership, the program, over a number of years. But first of all, Chris, tell us a bit about who you are and what you're about.
Oh, hi everyone. I'm Chris, and actually today we're in Matlock
We
in
are.
Derbyshire, which is somewhere I've been living now for 6 years with my wife, Pat Barty, having moved from London, where we spent many years, and where I used to work in IT. I had an IT career spanning 42 years.
Good effort, Chris.
Probably 12 years too many, but and nevertheless it was a good career. But then, having moved to Matlock and was working comfortably from home in the office upstairs, I then decided I didn't really want to work at all, and at the age of 60 decided to simply retire.
What a wonderful position to be in
Yeah.
as well in the Peak District.
Yeah, so I got my spreadsheet out, basically did my sums, and I thought, okay, yes, I'll miss the money, but actually, I'd rather not do the work. Time became more important.
Yeah.
So I took early retirement, age 60, started drawing down my pension that I'd been paying into, and instead started to follow other pursuits.
Indeed. And if we just rewind time a little bit, can you remember the first time we met?
I'm not sure if it's the first time. But
Yeah.
I do remember you at UBS coming in with the consultants at the time to introduce Agile to the IT methodology. We hadn't got that at all. We got something else at the time. So I do remember you coming in. I remember having initial meetings where I think you probably amazed everybody by doing which is probably well known now, your head, shoulders, knees and toes routines to everybody in the room.
Yeah, at a Swiss bank, no less.
At a Swiss bank. And I remember it bringing a smile to my face because, all the managers were feeling rather uncomfortable. They clearly weren't sure what was going on. But it was a bit of an icebreaker. So I remember that. But the next thing I remember you as part of our team and giving us guidance in Agile. And it's one of those occasions where, I think it's like a bit of a turning point for me at least, and people who I was working with. And so far as we were sort of all pretty miserable before in terms of we hadn't got much structure, and we weren't performing very well. And then suddenly we got a sort of a bit of a vision, and we started working more friendly towards each other and possibly more playfully together. So it proved to be a sort of for me at least, a sort of a golden period of IT. It lasted about 3 years, I think.
Oh, that's a long time for a golden era in the modern day.
Yeah. But then I can't remember how long you stayed at UBS for, actually, before you departed.
It was a good few years working at a Swiss bank, and I really enjoyed the challenge of what it meant to support, an agile transformation or journey. And working with your team was wonderful because the team was always quite keen to get feedback, and then you would do whatever the suggestions I offered suited you, and then things would improve. The thing I remember most about you, Chris, though, was this was during the time when I dreamed about having a family of my own, and I wasn't sure that would happen. And then in those years, I would really think about what it meant to be a human being and my life purpose, as you do. And so I thought, to leave my mark, it would be really good to do a TEDx talk. And in order to qualify to do a TEDx talk, I need to come up with a special idea that's worth some kind of recognition of value to society. So I would carry this wish every day to work at this bank. And during the breaks, I would think about it. And I started coming up with this idea of, oh, what about there's something about gardening and nurturing, even though it seems so counterintuitive in, tall glass buildings with marble floors and walls, that perhaps could feel sometimes a little bit cold to the human soul. So I came up with this idea of enterprise gardening and the metaphor of gardening and organizations, and using, nurture versus war metaphors to look at, how we enable change. And not being a very good gardener, but fortunately for my family, better with human beings, I went to an expert, and it turned out Chris is a bit of a green fingers, weren't you? So I pitched this idea about enterprise gardening to you, and I think that's really how we became friends.
Yes, and actually, I'm not, well, more green fingered now than I used to be, but I do remember clearly as part of that talk that you gave me a gift of sunflower seeds.
Oh, yes.
In a little tube. I think it contained its own soil and everything, but it was just like three seeds in the tube. And I took them home and planted them, and they did grow.
Yeah.
So they did grow into full-grown sunflowers. And following that, in subsequent years, I did plant loads of sunflowers. During the pandemic stage, I planted loads on this estate here, because sunflowers is one of those things. It's such a, when it grows, when it blossoms, it's so beautiful. It's so outstanding. It's 6 foot tall, some of them.
Yeah.
So yes, I did definitely enjoy that. But I'm not sure. Did you actually grow any of your own sunflowers at that time?
Well, what happened in the end, because I was so nervous about gardening itself, and I felt it was really important to be, congruent. I ended up getting a sunflower head from my daughter's school, and I asked the gardener. So then I got some of those seeds, and because it was during COVID, and there were so many, and I didn't want any of them to go to waste. Every seed has so much potential. I ended up growing them indoors, and I have this thing where I really value every life, so I named each one of them as well. And I like the idea of having a particular genre of names. Like when you're at school, they might be, your house that you belong to at school might have been a set of composers, right? A particular composer, and mine was Handel. I decided to choose like Marvel Universe. So we would have like Captain America and Thor and Black Widow and Spider-Man, and we would have all these sunflowers that were named, and of course we would remember who each one was. And it was always really fun to see, like, oh, today's Captain America is bigger than Thor, he's taller, and it would be completely different to the actual script and story of Marvel, and that gave us great joy.
That's amazing, because during that whole pandemic phase, and I took the whole idea of the sunflowers, and it was such a depressing time in Britain and lockdown and all that shit.
Yeah.
And we propagated probably about 40 or 50 sunflowers in here.
Wow.
And we took them around the estate, and everyone planted a sunflower in the garden at the front.
Oh, I remember you
saying. And it turned out to be quite a moving event. And to be honest, all of that stemmed originally from that little box of sunflowers, because I'd never grown a sunflower before in my life.
Oh my goodness, Chris.
Prior to that.
Yeah.
I'd seen them in, Van Gogh and all the rest of it, but never actually grew one. I've seen them in fields, but they're quite easy to grow, actually.
Yeah, and I think you sharing the story now reminds me how generous human beings are when they have a little something that's good, and worthwhile. They offer it to others as soon as they can, right? Because it's just about sharing that joy.
Yeah.
So apart from this passion for gardening, which I'm still developing, we also share a passion for writing, don't we?
We do, yes. And I'm not sure I had a passion really until I finished work. And it was, I I'd obviously written so much in my professional career, but that was all.
So requirements documents for
It
software.
it was requirements documents,
Yeah.
requirements documents, all very technical, very dry, but very precise and sort of logical. And I spent a career doing that.
Yeah.
And I didn't, I fancied writing something just wacky and wild and letting my imagination run away with me. And I had decided I'd wanted to write a book, and then didn't really know what about at first. But then I think just the state of where we were in the world at that time.
Yeah.
This was before the pandemic, so we've got Brexit going on and we've got climate change being discussed and all sorts of issues in the world. And feeling very frustrated about not being able to do much about much.
Yeah.
I thought, well, at least I can actually articulate my thoughts through a fictional book.
Yeah, wonderful. And I remember we then sort of developed a friendship by becoming writing buddies as well, weren't we? So
yes.
It was really interesting to see. I mean, let's call it progress. I know, words are limiting in a way, but it was really interesting to see the progress you made in writing your book, because obviously you were retired and I was and am still working. And I remember feeling sort of a little bit of jealousy or envy that Chris had all this golden time to play with this book. But actually, it was quite challenging, wasn't it, having all that time?
It was actually, yes. And to be honest, although I'd set out to sort of write a book and let my mind run wild, I did find initially I was in sort of IT mode still, and I was very analytical about it.
Yes.
So I was trying to do like a full plot and analyze it, and I wanted the step-by-step character development, and I tried plotting the whole thing out, and I hated it. I really found after a few weeks of doing it, and reading, because I think what was that thing with the storybook?
Yeah, the story grid.
The story grid. We tried doing that together, and I hated it.
Yeah, it was the idea where you could map. It was big design up front.
Yeah.
Map your entire story from the beginning, the hero's journey, to the end. And I just found that I lost interest for my book when I did it, because I was like, wow, now I know the ending. I'm not sure I can be bothered to write it.
Exactly. And it reminded me very much of the sort of a waterfall model of IT, of, having to define everything up front first before you've even put any words down on paper.
Yeah, but that's not to say that isn't a valid way of working. It was just that we happened to both find it too difficult.
I found it very, very difficult. But also, I think I could have done it, but I found it too similar to what my job was.
Yeah.
I found it it was too disciplined, actually.
Okay.
And then I, just looking at the different types of writers, discovering that there were these other writers that call themselves pantsers, sort of live by the seats of their pants and just go for it, just let the pages write themselves almost.
Yeah.
And that was far more fun. And that's what I ended up doing in the end.
And it's funny you say that, because in the first book I wrote, The Dream Team Nightmare, and it's like a choose your own adventure fighting fantasy book where you the reader are in charge. There are 8 possible endings, and you play the role of an agile coach, and you work with a company full of agile teams, and they're not sure where they're going next, but you have about a week to support them in readopting agile before they're outsourced. And so I had this idea, and I remember writing this book when I was traveling mostly around Europe, and I would write about it at night. I would write about it. I would write it in the morning. I would use the printers in the hotel offices and just get really creative. And it was a lot of fun because I was able to capture what I knew, and that was all it was. I was documenting and playing. But the best thing was when you'd be sitting in the cafe or on the bus commuting, and then the characters would start talking to each other in my imagination. And it was just wonderful, because then I could just write down the dialogue and what happened next. And then it was, I guess, some spiritual people call it like braiding sweetgrass, but it's this idea that each strand would then come. And when I tried to write it as a linear book, the story just wasn't having it. And I was like, okay, I hear these sort of noisy, clamorous voices from each of the characters, and they all want a fair shout of the story. So the only way I could do it was like a choose your own adventure book, so that I could focus on what would happen. You know, a bit like Gwyneth Paltrow's movie
Yeah.
Sliding Doors, of what would happen if there were multiple endings, and that it would be okay that you didn't get a so-called happy ending, because that would still be full of learning. And Jim Hopper, the protagonist, in the end, I think he became a much richer character because of it. So that was a lot of fun to write. And what about you? Tell us a bit about your book, Chris.
So the basis or the premise behind this, which is Duality Protocol. So the premise behind it came again because I was like concerned about the world and what was going on and how Britain was changing over the years. And I just had this vision of a world where we were under resourced, you know, all the resources were being consumed, the climate was getting warmer. I've done some research on predictions of what would happen if we went to 3-4% above the pre-industrial levels of warming, and it was all very bleak. And I thought, well, if this did transpire, what would happen? I tried to follow it through.
Like a worst case scenario.
Like a worst case, yeah, like an utter worst case scenario. And a lot of the land mass was uninhabitable. Where would all these people go? And then it just so happens in my story that someone accidentally discovers that, you know, while developing memory implants for people who got Alzheimer's or dementia, they suddenly, some government guy asks the question, well, if you can do that, why can't you just put a whole personality on some sort of a chip? So the whole story develops as being how you could have one body but with two different personalities in it, and they would share time. So literally it would be
a timeshare in a body.
A timeshare. So 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off. And then there'd be a little switch, if you like. You wake up one morning and you're the other personality.
Yeah.
And that way you could save lots of resources because you've only got one mouth to feed.
Yeah, literally.
And you could the people who you really wanted to keep because they got knowledge, etc. You could make sure that they had a body to go into rather than dying off. It is dystopian, but it's also, I find it very amusing. I mean, it's
what made it amusing?
Well, just I guess it's the scenarios behind it. So, I mean, what happens in the story is that someone wakes up out of sync.
Yeah.
So
when they should have been asleep, it wasn't their turn.
It wasn't their turn.
Right.
So they woke up like a day early and was with the wrong partner. And then from that it was a whole. That's where the story sort of develops and why did that happen, and you know the ensuing sort of events around people trying to gain control of your body.
Yeah.
But I suppose what made it amusing was I'd set out my characters. I chose film stars and I just printed their faces up and put them on my wall.
Yeah.
And
so film stars who would play the characters, effectively.
Film stars who I thought might well play the characters. I got people like Helen Mirren and you know, and Bobby Brown who's out of Stranger Things.
Okay, yeah.
I've got all these characters.
I hope you're listening.
I've got them all plenty out of them. And then when I sat down to write a scene with them, I put their heads on.
Wow.
So that I could sort of try and be them. And I just found that whole process, I was laughing most of the day.
Yeah.
It was, I just found it really amusing. I was probably just looking at me from the side, must have been looking a bit crazy.
Yeah.
So I was just sitting there, giggling away to myself.
Yeah, and I think that was a precondition for me writing my first book, but then, you know, having completed writing my second one now, all about play and the science and power of play, I made myself this promise that I would only work on the book when I enjoyed it, which kind of puts into question, what does discipline mean and what does managing your attention mean? And what I found was that when I enjoyed myself and the process of writing, I was just so much more effective and efficient And that was also reflected in the reader's feedback, right? Because no one wants to read something that was tortuous to write, no matter
Yeah.
how clever or intelligent it is.
Yeah. And yes, and yes. So when I was in the zone, I was in the zone.
Yeah.
But I found I couldn't force it either.
Yes.
So if I wasn't feeling it at all, it was like there's no point turning up at the computer to write anything because it would just turn out wrong.
Yeah, this I remember watching a TED talk by Elizabeth Gilbert, and she wrote Eat, Pray, Love, which became a movie that Julia Roberts starred in. And Elizabeth Gilbert talks about how when she writes and the muse visits her, and you and I had lots of conversations about what it means to have the muse visit you. It was a bit, Elizabeth would say, it was like having Dobby, the house elf, come to your side, and then he'd say a few things, or let you know what's what, and then you can kind of write it down, a bit like the poet Ruth Stone. And in so many ways it's like you kind of just receiving this information, and you just have to get it down quite quickly. And I certainly when I started hearing the voices of the different characters from my first book do that. It was really good when I then got into flow with my second book, because I could really hear the stories of the children and the adults around me who hadn't played enough, and the consequences and impact of that, and what they really wanted me to share, and the experience of being able to have more playful adults around them. Yeah,
that sort of brings into the whole thing, isn't it, about when you're developing characters, how you end up taking on their emotional state of mind.
Yeah,
because if I try to play that character, be that character, and what would they do, how would they feel, and that actually it's quite an interesting thing to do, but it's had its darker moments, because if I was writing something quite tragic and quite dark,
yeah,
at the end of it I'd feel rubbish.
Yeah, I guess it's like method acting or whatever.
Yes, well, I suppose so. Yeah. So, which is why I try to keep it light. But unless you envelop yourself in a character, I don't think you can really put anything down that's worth. I think your emotions show in how you write it, providing you're in that state.
Yeah, and I think for me, learning to befriend my inner critic, and I mean, I call her Mara, according to the Hindu tradition, but it's, that it's my friend, right? It could be my ego, you could call it anything else, but just developing my own emotional awareness, intelligence was fundamental to writing the book, bringing it together, and then eventually finish it. Because if you hate yourself because you don't think you're doing a good enough job writing the book, then whatever comes out is really toxic, I feel. Even if it doesn't look like it on the page, there's something, I think, that seeps through, doesn't it, through your work?
Yeah, it does. Yeah, it does. And I definitely found that, because I decided to go this way of not being overly structured, that how I felt on that morning I chose to write determined the outcome of the story. So if I'd have turned up another day with a slightly different frame of mind, the story would have been different.
Yes.
It was literally the story was developing as I was sitting down.
Yeah, but I do notice that there's like an essence or a soul to my creations that you're right, depending on your entry point into that universe or that book or that creation, the essence would have stayed the same. It just depends on the journey that you would have got in, and the characters fundamentally would have been the same, even though they might have made slightly different decisions in that timeline.
And the one downside I found, which is perhaps a major downside of not having a structured approach, was because I've got a plot and several characters, trying to juggle that and weave all this information and these different threads, these different character arcs into a coherent plot that came to a conclusion. That was interesting, because I barely remembered what I'd written.
Yes.
So I had to go back and actually document what I'd written, and as sort of metadata to the story. So I'd got chapters with metadata, bullet points, and what they did, and I drew up a timeline, to make sure
A
that
map, yeah.
a map, just so I could make sure that the characters were actually where they were and where could they have been there at the time they said they were there and that sort of thing. So even though I didn't do the structure thing up front, I found afterwards.
Yeah, you have to erect the scaffolding afterwards to still
Yes.
finish off the dabbing of the paint and everything else.
Yes, I couldn't put the roof on until I'd done that because otherwise.
No, so there's no cheating the
No.
process, I think.
No.
And the other really interesting aspect of writing that came to me this time with the second book. With the first one, it was much more technical. So, I'd like diff the files. I'd know if I'd missed a word just by doing, diff whatever, and you could compare files. And it was, I'd say, very mechanical.
Yeah.
And the computer obviously did a lot of that work. And I just had to issue the command. But that was the way I was writing. But with this second book, because I chose to have the book in two formats, in terms of like Google Docs, and I was writing in Readsy, I decided to keep both of them alive because I was gonna, I'm still deciding where to take it next for, to be published. And every time I went to make an edit in one place, I would go and obviously edit it in two places, but then an idea would then intercept or come into my mind, and it'd nudge me to, from chapter 6 it says go to chapter 4 and find this reference, and I'd go, okay. So I'd go to chapter 4 and go to that point, and I realized that actually there was a defect I'd introduced there without realizing it. It was like something, how my fingers and my body knew when something needed correcting or shaping that my conscious mind wouldn't have been aware of. And it was, I guess it's maybe what people who do pottery feel, with the pot. And I could just feel that with the book this time, and it felt so magical that the book was looking after its own interest. I quite like that as well.
Yeah, I certainly appreciated version management.
Right, yeah.
But a lot more when I was doing the edits and trying to make sure
Yeah.
I hadn't introduced defects, and
Yeah.
could I go back to a previous version if I wanted to. I hadn't quite lost my IT desire to sort of get use a bit of software to check what I'd done. So I adopted I originally bought Grammarly, which is like a very clever word processor, but syntax checker, and which I found fascinating. It was a really nice tool to use. But then again, after a while, I started to notice I was losing some of my voice because
you were just accepting the
corrections. I was accepting the corrections, even though, hang on a second, this character does speak like that because this is the way they are, and it was trying to correct to make it more into a more grammarly correct English.
Yeah, how interesting.
So software's great. Well, the version I was using, Grammarly, is good. I don't think there's any substitute for your own proofreading and your own keeping your own voice in there.
Yeah. And then last autumn, you joined the Playful Leadership Program on the Origination course. So what was the experience or your takeaway memory of that?
Well, it's interesting because I always say this to Portia before I go on a course. I'm always slightly fearful.
And this is specifically about my courses.
Any course really, but also I think mainly I suppose to some extent your courses, because I never know what to expect. I know I'm going to expect to do things I don't normally do.
Sure.
And to sort of take myself out of my normal comfort zone, and the like, which is fine. I don't mind doing that, but it does raise a sort of a bit of an anxiety level, which is good though, because I don't like to be too comfortable all the time.
Well, and emotionally, anxiety and excitement are actually close siblings, aren't they?
Are,
depending on how enjoyable the actual activity is on the day.
But I think at the time, I remember for a start, the group of people were fantastic. So it's not like when you're going into a meeting, say it's an organisation, a corporate meeting where everyone's got their own hidden agenda.
Sure.
And you're sort of out to protect yourself. What main overriding sensational feeling coming away from it is that there's a group of people who really interconnected, did their own thing, but was very communicative and very collaborative. All the things you'd hope for in a sort of a playful environment. So, like with anything in life, it's often more about the people than it is about the activity.
Yeah, and that's what I've noticed about creating this playful leadership program. And you've been to early iterations of it where it was just pure play signs, and we do some coloring in and some structured reflection, and those things were useful, but it never really tapped into the inner resources that I felt was there. And I think when I started moving into the space of combining play science with something called systemic constellations and really understand, and also resonant healing, it was just looking at all these ways of better understanding our hearts and minds and connecting it all, that I noticed bringing like-hearted adults together has this kind of what I call play alchemy now. And we just invite everyone around the cauldron or whatever you want to call it, the pizza table, and then we all kind of just share who we are, just bring who we are as much, or share as much or little as we want. But things would just start happening, wouldn't they? And people would have insights.
I think one of the activities which I found really quite amazing was the one where the guys came up with a song and we all contributed a phrase.
Yes, that was And
how
oh, that's our dear friend Stuart Cox, who's also a long-standing alumnus for Playful Leadership, and he and Sal Ronaldo and Paul Punchart, they're like the troubadours of the group because they're very good with stringed instruments. And we did like collaborative songwriting where Stuart invited us to write just a sentence of our experience of being on the course. And then we rewrote that all on little cards, just each of us, and we just put it into the mix. And then the three of them somehow stringed the words together, didn't they?
They did.
And then they played this beautiful song called Yesterday's Song, and it was...
I think you recorded that, didn't
we
you?
did, and I'll include a link to the song, but it was just the most beautiful, touching thing.
And it just shows in a way what can be achieved in a very short space of time with a group of people who are invested into that sort of process.
Yeah, and all the time that they were doing that, because they were more musically inclined, the rest of us were making clay pots or painting in our books or just staring out the window. But we all felt that we were adding value and doing whatever it was we wanted, didn't we, as we moved towards our playful selves. And that's I'd say the play alchemy, the magic of it.
It is, yeah. Yes, I do remember having a plaster Paris pumpkin. Or
paper mache
pumpkin.
Oh yes,
that's it.
Yeah.
And I don't know, I was stressing over this whole sort of getting this thing to look like something. I don't know what I was expecting to look like. I've actually got it in the kitchen at the moment, but for various reasons I wasn't happy with the first incarnation of it, of my painting, and I went over it and over it and over it and over it to make it into something that, for somehow it didn't speak to me the first time. But then eventually it turned out okay. It turned out quite nice. But so that whole play process, I don't always find it like straightforward.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It's like, oh crap, that's a mistake, that is. And I know there shouldn't be any mistakes in play, but it's all, that needs correcting.
Yeah, well, the play process is definitely a squiggly journey, isn't it?
Yeah.
And I think emotionally as well, the more willing we are to acknowledge the difficulty in, when something appears and that looks nothing like what it was in my imagination, it was far more glorious. The moment we allow that judgment to stop us from moving forward, even if we were just to acknowledge that and laugh about it, that would be enough, wouldn't it?
Yeah. And having watched various programs on the TV where they investigate pictures by famous artists, is it a fake, is it real?
Okay.
You often see that artists have reused their canvas, and underneath is an earlier version or some mistake that they've done over.
It's the first iteration,
it's like a first iteration. So it's perfectly fine.
Yeah, and it's fun you say that, because if ever folks at home buy these kind of paper mache pumpkins from Hobbycraft. I highly recommend, by the way. I've discovered that you can just reskin it, which is effectively paint over it every October.
Yeah.
And that's what I've done now. So the moment I did
Right.
that pumpkin at Origination, I then went home and I thought, oh, I think this pumpkin of mine last year is looking a bit
Yeah.
tired. I want to do something else. And so I put a different coat on it and, use different techniques to make it
That's a good
refreshed.
idea.
And
Yeah.
I wonder if it's, it's like archaeology, isn't it? And it's like the landmass and, like sedimentary rock. And you see like the different layers that builds up over time that makes up our planet kind of thing. That's like the art, isn't it? It's like the soul of our work. Every edit or version of our books or whatever it is we create, be it ourselves or something else, adds to who we are rather than as something that deserves covering up.
That's right. And I don't, like I say, I don't think there's ever a final version of my book or because there's always opportunities to sort of go back and revisit and
tweak it or
it.
Play with it,
improve it if that's how you think you might improve something based on other experiences.
And one of your next steps you're considering is turning it into a screenplay as well, aren't you?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I don't know the first thing about how to do that.
Oh, we could play with that for sure.
It's because I know with screenplays, I did have a quick look, and then there's all these stage directions and things like that.
Yeah.
So how you go back doing prose to that? It'd be another learning curve.
Yeah, exactly.
But yes.
We play on for as long as we want.
But yes, it's another way of sort of taking what you've already created and giving it a different life.
Yeah, like another coating on a pumpkin.
Yeah.
So, Chris, as our time comes to an end now, if I were to ask you for 1 or 2 tips on how to lead a more playful life, what would they be?
Oh, crimes! I think for a start, you've got to be willing to feel uncomfortable. Because if you stay doing exactly what you always do, where you feel very comfortable, you're not likely to enrich or enhance what you know already or what you feel already. So I always find I think finally getting out of my comfort zone slightly. But I think the key thing is to find the right people to play with.
Oh.
Yes, definitely the right people to play with.
Yeah.
And then you can have fun.
And that's so lovely because for me, sort of starting on my own play journey where I hadn't quite played enough in my own childhood, I realised that as adults, we can reclaim some of those friendship building skills and you can find new friends, right?
Exactly.
Even as adults, which I didn't really quite realise what that means, shared values, to be lighthearted or just simply enjoy doing the same activities together.
Yeah. Because if you notice as children, you did go out of your comfort zone a lot to learn how to climb a ladder or how to climb a tree, how to do whatever, and you'd have to go out in your comfort zone, but there'd be a good friend, your best friend with you, who would be the one that would sort of encourage you or even laugh when you fell over, to be honest.
And then help pick you up
help pick you up. But that's why you sort of have a best friend or best friends when you're younger.
Yeah.
You tend to meet and group with those people.
Yeah, and it's never too late to form friendships.
No, it's not. No, I think there's a tendency in your middle life when it's all very work oriented to sort of forget that.
Yeah,
it's easy to lose sight of that.
So it's important to take time to make friends.
It is definitely
both new friends and as well as maintain friendships.
Definitely.
So tell me, Chris, this book, Duality Protocol, how do our viewers get hold of it?
Well, it's on Amazon. It can be bought as a paperback.
There we go. Lovely. And
it's also in Kindle format. So it's there now. You can search on Amazon app and you'll find it. And if anyone did and does buy it, I'd love feedback, by the way. I think it's one of the key things that if you're a new author and it's what you really want to hear is, that was okay, that was good, that was brilliant, but also, what about doing it this way? What about doing it that way?
And you're open to maybe do some reading for book clubs all sorts of things online or in person, depending on where it is.
Yeah, definitely, yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And you know what? I'm going to throw it out there. So if anyone wants a signed copy as well from Chris, then let me know as well, and I'm sure we can arrange for that to happen if
definitely.
you wanted to. So thank you so much today for playing on Play Alchemy, and I hope you spend time playing more with your true friends. Bye.
Take care.